Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
I live in Anadarko, Oklahoma, but I am originally from San Diego. My first UFO encounter was around 1976. My father, mother, and I moved from San Diego to Spring Valley. My mother worked nights as a nurse for Mercy Hospital downtown from 10 p.m. until 8 a.m. One night after we dropped my mother off at work, we did our usual nighttime routine and stopped by Taco Bell. On the way home going east, I spotted an object outside my window facing south. It appeared to be a white orb-like object just above the hills following us on a horizontal course. I pointed it out to my father, who at first thought I was joking or making up something. When he saw it, he became afraid. Know a little bit about my father. He was around 6'8" and the toughest man alive. I never saw him afraid of anything. We continued on home, both of us looking at the object, which climbed out of view into the sky. We quickly went home and rushed into the house, my father leading the way by unlocking the door. We set our food on the railing and I closed the door when the doorbell rang. I thought it was one of my father's friends who occasionally stopped by after we took my mom to work. I quickly opened the door over the protest of my father and saw a being standing in front of our door and a white glowing disc-like craft over our street. The being had the head of a male lion and a black robe with stars, galaxies, and comets. The strange thing was that the objects on the robe were moving. The spiral galaxies swirling, comets shooting, stars twinkling. Then the lion-headed being roared and my father and I fell back towards the floor and everything went black. My mother found us the next day in the hallway with the front door open and me and my father asleep on the floor. She woke us up yelling what we were doing and why wasn't I at school. I tried to explain what we saw last night, but my father told me to be quiet. Not being a child of the 70s, I knew not to disobey my father and attempted to tell my mother later after school while my father was at work. I will give my mother credit, she listened, but I don't think she believed me. Then in 1985 I was 15 and living in El Reno, Oklahoma. A bunch of friends and I were leaving a friend of ours' house, and by a bunch, I mean about 15 or 18 guys. It was around 8 p.m. At night we were going to Booker T. Washington's gym to play basketball when an object fell out of the sky from the south heading to the north. The object was making a buzzing noise almost like a helicopter but louder. We all looked up and saw a large ball of light about 20 feet in diameter falling out of the sky. It smelled like sulfur and was changing color from white, yellow, green, blue, and red, then back to white. It looked like it was landing or crashing at the neighborhood park about 10 blocks away. One of the guys looked at me and suggested we all go see what it was. The reason why he looked at me was that I was into science, and jokingly they called me the professor. I got a sudden feeling of dread thinking about investigating the object and said no. Everyone shrugged and we went on to play basketball. My biggest encounter was in 1991. I was in the Oklahoma National Guard, a new father, and the first Iraq War was on and I was waiting to get deployed. I brought the new year in with my child and my girlfriend, and since they stayed at her mother's house I had to leave. It was between 1 and 1:30 a.m. I was walking across the band field towards home when I saw an object in the northwest. It looked like a star with a trail streaming from it and white objects falling toward the ground. At first I thought it was the second coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but then I remembered he comes from the east. So my next thought was that the Russians launched a missile and this was it. Tinker Air Force Base is about 25 miles from El Reno. Stuck with indecision about whether I should warn my mother and little brother or my girlfriend and child, I stood there watching. The object was coming closer still with a tail and with objects falling to the ground. Then beams of light shot out in front of it, so I thought it was a plane. I felt sorry for the plane's people and thought it was a 747. I had never seen a plane crash and I continued watching. Then the strangest thing happened. The headlights started sweeping the ground. I thought, well, they are looking for a place to ditch. Then it occurred to me, when did 747s get searchlights? One beam of light went to the north and the other to the south, and then they both came together on me standing in the middle of the band field and went out. It was right in front of me when my sight came back. A UFO, disc-shaped with the back end blown off. Debris was falling off the back end towards the ground, but when it reached the ground it just evaporated. The UFO was trailing smoke and it had a row of windows on its side. The lights inside the UFO were emergency red and I saw silhouettes of beings running back and forth. Then one stopped and looked down at me. I thought to myself, here's my chance to make contact with someone from another planet. I had a mini flashlight on my keychain and I flashed it up at it a couple of times with no response. So I waved with my right arm and it copied me, then with both arms and it copied me. I heard a vehicle stop on the street behind me and a man, and I was deeply concerned about its well-being. We stood there looking at each other for what felt like hours when another figure who was running past stopped, looked down at me, grabbed my friend, and went to the undamaged part of the craft. 6 balls of light, then a 7th shot towards the southwest, all changing colors from white, yellow, green, blue, red, and back to white. I ran home and woke my mother up, frantically telling her what I saw. Then to a party where I knew a friend of mine was at. I told him and he thought I was full of it, but I convinced him to go to his house to watch the news. We were watching Channel 4 News when an anchorwoman, Uzi Brown Washington, came on and said, "If you saw an object in the sky, it was," and then she was cut off. All my friend could do was look at me with his mouth open. We stayed up until 5 that morning waiting for her to come back on with news of what I saw. I'm 52. I've only told this to a handful of people I felt I could trust.
I live in Nova Cruz, Rio Grande do Norte, Brazil. I usually go on walks and hikes with my friends on the nearby fields, grasslands, and hills. There are lots of green areas around the place. We always go together for safety and also because it's good to have someone to talk to. But one day, all my friends were busy and I was left alone for the hike. I only went there in the first place because I felt bored and thought that some adventure could spice my day up. The first hours were okay. It was the 10th day of July at about 4 p.m. I felt refreshed when I saw that beautiful landscape. There are those huge rocks scattered around, so I decided to climb them as usual. I climbed up the biggest rock that was there. I and my friends call it the whale rock since it kind of looks like the back of a whale and also is pretty huge. I got a nice view from up there. I could see trees, cacti, bushes, grass, etc., but one thing caught my attention quickly. It was this person wearing a silly costume. I don't know very well how to describe it, but the best way I have to explain how it looked is that it kind of looked like those cartoon depictions of a beehive. I got worried because it is usually really hot in this part of the country. It was this person wearing a silly costume. I don't know very well how to describe it, but the best way I have to explain how it looked is that it kind of looked like those cartoon depictions of a beehive. I got worried because it is usually really hot in this part of the country. I climbed down to the ground and started walking toward the hive man. He seemed to notice me, and as I got closer I started to notice how weird he was. His movements were really fluid but also really mechanical too. The fabric of the suit seemed to have a metallic glow to it while having a rusty aspect. It had no facial features but 2 amber-colored discs that reflected like mirrors on where its eyes should be. At first, the hive man seemed curious about me, staring and investigating my looks. It even tried to get closer and seemed to have really friendly intentions. I wasn't scared either, I just found the whole situation weird. That was until the other hive man showed up. The second one was different from the first one. It was taller and bulkier, and instead of 2 discs for eyes it had just one visor-like thing. I felt intimidated when I saw it from a distance. I think they were as tall as 3 meters or 2.5 meters. I ran towards the bushes and hid from them. They both were looking at each other and making gestures as if they were talking. They then started walking towards some vegetation. I tried to follow them so I could track the hive man and take a picture as proof, but they vanished. I'm still confused, amazed, and a bit scared about what happened. I still go to that same spot in search of any traces of the hive man, but it's all gone.
I was reclining on my couch, staring at the ceiling while I listened to some music. If it helps, I was listening to The Who. A little while later I noticed myself zoning out to thoughts and theories and what-if scenarios that would just give me stress. So I snap out of it and look to my side, and there he is. The Michelin Man. About a foot away from my couch. Hand held up and head leaning in towards me. He didn't look scary. I wasn't scared. I was just curious. It was as if he was about to grab me, but I saw him and like some cartoon, he stopped midway. And I saw him walk backwards while still looking at me. He went behind the curtains of the gallery and just sort of disappeared between them. For some really strange reason, I didn't feel like getting up and investigating. I just laid back and resumed my music. It just kind of sunk into me now, and I thought I'd share. I don't feel scared or threatened or anything. In fact, I find myself smiling a little thinking about it. I don't know what's really going on. I had another weird encounter with an anteater-looking humanoid, so I don't know what's up with my house and humanoids. But that was definitely far scarier than this.
When I was in my early teens, I witnessed something that I have never been able to explain. This occurred in northern Minnesota. I have included a picture of what it looked like to me. I was in the woodlot behind the barn around 9 p.m. It was in July 1971 and I was out there with my collie dog Bonnie. Bonnie started barking and running towards the far edge of the woods. I called for her, but she continued running. I started to chase after her. As I got nearer to the small field, Bonnie was laying down looking towards the sky. I looked in the same direction and saw a bright yellow light coming towards us. The light got brighter and larger. Bonnie barked a few more times and ran back into the woods. She was scared. Well, I was scared also. The light was hovering above me. I felt paralyzed. I wanted to run but just couldn't move. I looked at the light and started to make out a shape. I have always said that it was a balloon man. It was round in the body and segmented legs and arms. The head was a bright yellow light. I couldn't see a face, just a bright blinding light. It hovered for a minute then moved towards me. It was right in front of me. I'd say it was 8 feet tall and very wide. There was an intense heat coming from it also. I had trouble breathing and was very uncomfortable. Then it started to hover and circle around me. I thought I was going to pass out. Then suddenly it just disappeared, simply vanished. As soon as it did, I dropped to the ground and started shivering. I could move but I was so cold and felt weak and sick. I laid there for a long time. I heard my mom calling and then Bonnie was beside me barking. My mom was frantic and tried to get me to my feet. I couldn't stand it. I was just too weak to move. Soon my older brothers showed up and they carried me to the house. I was sick in bed for about a week. The doctor said I had a severe reaction to poison sumac, which I know wasn't correct. I had a sore red rash on my face and arms. The balloon man burned me somehow and had weakened me. After I recuperated, I told my mom what had happened. She was surprised by what I described. She knew I didn't have poison sumac, but she didn't question the doctor. I never told anyone else about my contact with the balloon man, but I told my brothers not to go into the far field at night. They just laughed.
A sighting of capital importance took place on the island of Reunion, which is situated in the Indian Ocean between Mauritius and Madagascar, on the plain known as La Plaine de Caffres. The date of the sighting was July 31, 1968, and the time, 9:00 a.m. The witness, M. Luce Fontaine, is aged 31, a farmer, married, with a family, his wife being a teacher. Everybody is in agreement in considering him a serious, hard-working man, who is completely worthy of trust. I was at the kilometer 21 mark, in a small clearing in the middle of a forest of acacia trees, that morning, and I was bending down and picking some grass for my rabbits when I suddenly saw a sort of oval-shaped cabin in the clearing. It was 25 meters from me, and as though suspended at a height of 4 or 5 meters from the ground. The extremities of it were dark blue, the center part lighter, more transparent, rather like the windscreen of a Peugeot 404. Above and below it had what looked like 2 glass feet of shining metal. In the center of the cabin were 2 individuals with their backs towards me. The one on the left turned right round and so faced me. He was standing, small, about 90 centimeters in height, enveloped from head to foot in a sort of one-piece overall, a bit like the suit worn by the Michelin Man. The one on the right simply turned his head round towards me, but all the same I had time to catch a glimpse of his face, which was partly masked by a sort of helmet. Then both turned their backs to me, and there was a flash, as strong as the electric arc of a welding machine. Everything went white around me. A powerful heat was given off, and then, as if it were a sort of blast of wind, and a few seconds later there was nothing there anymore. Then approached the spot over which the object had been. There were no marks. The object had a diameter of 4 or 5 meters and was about 2.5 meters measured through from top to bottom. It was of a bluish color, with white on the upper and lower parts. I told my wife all about it, and then the gendarmerie, and everyone at once believed me.
On Sunday, March 14, 1976, the last thing on the minds of Vicent Coral and his wife Carmen was an encounter with beings from another world. Their son had just been drafted in Spain's compulsory military service, and tearful goodbyes had been exchanged at the draftee induction center located in the town of Marines. After spending the day in the local area, the Corals began the long trip home to the town of Almenara, driving along small roads of Spain's Castellan region. At around 10 p.m., the couple found itself facing a strange phenomenon in the night skies, a brilliant white oval that floated lazily to the left of their own car. Believing at first that it might be the headlights of a car on a nearby hill, the Corals steered their Renault 4 liters toward their ultimate destination. No sooner had the vehicle gone a few hundred feet did they become aware of the fact that all was not well. The alarmed couple thought that they were driving into a luminous tornado of sorts as a very curious object appeared to rise out of the ground. Bathing the object with his car's high beams, Mr. Coral was startled to see that it was a person. "I suppose that it had 2 legs," he would tell distinguished Spanish investigator Juan José Benitez, who investigated the case, "because it reminded me of a human profile. However, since the legs were so close together, it looked more like a column than a human being. The thing was tall and wore a close-fitting, one-piece outfit." The outlandish entity stood on the ground in what Vicent Coral described as a military 10-hut position, arms stiffly at its side and ramrod straight, looking at the oncoming vehicle. The couple's initial fascination changed to fear as the Renault's lights suddenly went out, leaving them in pitch blackness. The smell of burning wires soon filled the passenger compartment and Coral was forced to pull over. While all this happened, the entity vanished into the darkness. Vicent and Carmen Coral, their car's electrical system ruined, were left to wonder what had happened. According to researcher Benitez, Mrs. Coral proved to have a much better recall of the situation than her husband, adding the interesting detail that the entity's outfit was made of narrow, slightly inflated bands from its neck down to its waist. She went as far as to describe the entity as similar to Bibendum, the world-famous Michelin Man, only less so.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.